KKND2 is a game rammed full of contradictions. There were huge improvements in some areas and equally large regressions in others. The studio learned many lessons from the first game, but managed to forget almost as many lessons in the process. Difficult and time-consuming additions were made, while quick wins were ignored. Some of these things were praised by reviewers and the game was fondly remembered by some, but it sold less copies and is largely forgotten today. Hi, I'm Calivan, and today we're going to talk a little bit about a sequel that managed to be both better and worse at the same time. The first instalment of KKND was released in March 97. It was thematically interesting, but pretty lacking in the mechanics department. Mission design was poor, controls were clunky, and features were basic at best. It did include a load of FMV featuring real actors, but unfortunately the writing was less than stellar. A slightly improved version was released in October of the same year, which tidied up a few things but didn't really change the base game that much. The following August, KKND2 Krossfire arrived and was met with a resounding meh from the industry. PC Zone described it as an unoriginal game, a clone of a clone, and assigned it an underwhelming score of 66. Their review goes on to state that it's actually better than KKND, which starts to make that score feel a little unfair when you realise they gave the original game an 85. This review, and others like it, are perplexing. Firstly, it seems a bit strong to label a sequel as unoriginal because it's similar to the previous game in the series. It might be factually true, but it's like going into a barbecue restaurant and complaining that all of their food is cooked the same way. Many sequels, most even, are unoriginal by design, and making that a core point of contention appears to be particularly lazy to me. Secondly, and probably far more importantly, there's quite a lot of originality within KKND2. Thematically, it is very similar, and although the graphics are improved, they do represent a lot of the same units. But once you dive under the hood and actually get into the game, there's quite a lot of features that certainly weren't a standard in 1998. I've covered the original KKND quite recently, so I'm not going to go into any detail when it comes to all of the absolute basics of this game. But instead, let's take a look over all of the differences so we can answer three important questions. Does KKND2 contain any originality? Is it better than KKND? And if so, by how much? Also, let's drop all of these acronyms, they're a real mouthful. So we're just going to refer to it by its tagline, Krossfire. That should save us all a bit of time. Let's start with the low-hanging fruit. Krossfire looks a hell of a lot better than KKND. The units are far more detailed and have way smoother animations. The buildings are no longer the bland, blocky structures seen in the first game, but instead have great definition, and the addition of some more moving parts and shadows really makes them feel part of the game world. On top of this, the maps look great. The tile textures are crisp and detailed, well shaded, and frequently interspersed with enough high-quality ground clutter to really bring the thing to life. The differences in the presentation are so stark that it's hard to believe that these games are only separated by a year. It's not simply an improvement, but instead a vast upgrade that from a modern perspective makes it feel like an old game rather than an ancient one. The first KKND looked like a mid-tier game from 1995, whereas Krossfire looks like a high-tier game from the end of the 90s. Obviously personal preferences play a big role, but from a purely objective point of view, I would say that it looks better than 1998's StarCraft and on par with 1999's Tiberium Sun. But onto something a bit more involved. Krossfire has a new unit type called constructibles. These are essentially pick and mix units that you can build to fill a specific role or niche. You pick a chassis, a turret and a number of upgrades and then save that blueprint into one of half a dozen build slots. You can then build those constructibles in the same manner you would any other unit. There are 3 different chassis sizes available and something like 10 different turrets, ranging from direct damage dealers like plasma guns to more utility items like radar and repair modules. On top of this, there are 5 other upgrades that you can use to improve things like speed and armour. Everything has a different price, and the more extravagant vehicles come with a more extravagant cost. This opens up a lot of variety. Stealth transports, heavy artillery or other fancy stuff that isn't available on any of the standard vehicles. Now, I'm not exactly an encyclopedia on these things, but this is a feature that I just don't remember seeing in any real-time strategy game before Krossfire. It's certainly not in any of the big names, and although it's somewhat similar to how the vehicles worked in Original War, that game wouldn't arrive till 2001. Not just a truly original feature, but one with both a reasonable amount of complexity and a real impact on the game. The further you upgrade your armoury, the more modules unlock, and these custom vehicles allow you to do things that your existing vehicles just can't, and more importantly, in a way that feels a bit personal to you. The third big improvement in Krossfire isn't as flashy as graphics or unique units, but has an impact on every moment of the game, and isn't something you'd immediately notice until you had spent a little time in it. It's a topic that we talk about a great deal more these days than we ever did back in the 90s, something we often call quality of life. You see, KKND was basic. It wasn't quite as bad as some of the first games that lacked drag selecting or limited the numbers of units you could select at any one time, but it hadn't really added anything that wasn't in the original 95 release of Command & Conquer. Krossfire is a whole generation ahead, and then some. There are a number of very useful hotkeys. You can put units in attack, stand ground or guard mode. You can press space to cancel their current order, or hold control to tell them to defend another unit or structure. You can use shift to queue up waypoints, which even works on production buildings to make new units follow a specific path to a final rally point. There are a whole slew of other buttons. Keys to jump to a fight, to your base and to other important structures. There's control group functions and even buttons to bookmark and jump to specific map locations. You do still need to do some clicking, but if you become familiar with all of these shortcuts, then building, gathering and fighting becomes a whole lot easier. On top of this, it features a smart select option. When enabled, a regular drag select will only select your combat units, instead of your resource gatherers, engineers and other supporting cast. Now, I'm pretty sure I'd seen this before Krossfire, but I can't quite remember where, but either way it was definitely not a standard feature at this time. On their own, no single one of these control features is much to write home about, but as a collection they make a dramatic difference to the game. Lots of other titles had some of these things, but very few, if any, had all of them in a single package, especially when you include the more situation-specific functions, like telling a group of units to scatter or ordering a tanker to automatically move to the nearest resource structure and resume the automated gathering process. Were all of these additions enough to call Krossfire a truly original game? No, I don't think so, but very few games are, and nor do they have to be. However, I think labelling it a clone of a clone is a vast disservice. It not only contains some original features, but from a control point of view represents a vast improvement, not only over its predecessor, but also over the game that its predecessor was heavily influenced by. Unfortunately for Krossfire, there are a few key problems that really hold it back, some of which were also huge weaknesses in the first release. The pathfinding and avoidance in Krossfire is just as terrible as it was in KKND. This was a key problem with every RTS from this period, but with KKND it is especially bad. However, there's one small caveat. The vastly improved control system does go some way to alleviating this problem. Left to their own devices, units will still fumble around like blindfolded alcoholics, but because it's far easier to select and issue orders, you can quickly resolve most of these problems yourself. The mission design is also still problematic. It's certainly an improvement over what was present in KKND, but some key problems remain. The last few minutes of a mission often involve you sitting on your hands, numbly staring at the screen while your units take forever to destroy the last of the enemy's buildings. The kill everything goal is still very much at the forefront, and there's a lot of wasted time where you run around the map trying to find the last holdout that you missed. Pacing is still a problem. It's very slow to expand your economy. You often find that you've got just enough to defend yourself but not enough to venture out and attack, so you end up doing very little for long periods while you wait to grow your income base to levels that actually allow you to do something. Don't get me wrong, Krossfire's single player missions are way more fun and interesting than KKND's, but I can't help but feel that it wouldn't have taken much in the way of extra development time to streamline the whole experience with a few important tweaks. The music variety is still also lacking, with not much more than 15 minutes of music for each faction. However, it still feels like a bit of an improvement. I'm not quite sure why. I think part of the problem with KKND was that the other frustration served to enhance the repetitiveness of the limited soundtrack, whereas in Krossfire the music is generally better and the overall reduced level of annoyance allows your brain to merge it into the background. There is an exception to this. The Series 9 soundtrack is jarring and feels like it's actually a weapon designed by the robots to confuse their human enemies. When I'm playing as the survivors, the music stays on. When I'm playing as the Evolved, the music gets turned down a bit, but as the robots, I have to either sit there in silence or go mad. I think one of the biggest missteps is in relation to the presentation and content of the briefings. I never enjoyed the unfunny humour of the first release, but the use of real actors did bring a bit of character to the game. The writing was poor, but there was never any problem with the acting or delivery, and as such I think all of those scenes still brought a lot of value. Krossfire went in a different direction, and instead used some CG talking heads that are almost completely devoid of any charm or charisma. They look dumb, they sound dumber, and it's hard to find anything positive to say about them whatsoever. They aren't bad in a way that's funny, campy or somewhat endearing, but bad in the kind of way that feels cheap and lazy. Honestly, it's just disappointing, not just because they're bad, but because the previous game had demonstrated that the studio could do a lot better.
You're a good commander, not like some others.
I feel the same way about some of the bugs. Occasionally missions just fail for no discernible reason, something that can happen immediately after loading in. Again, this is disappointing, but I've got no way to know how prevalent the problem was at the time. It might be a quirk on modern systems, or it might be something that was there all along. It certainly frustrated me this week, and is the key reason for the lack of variety of the footage I'm using for this video. In most respects, KKND2 Krossfire is an overall better game than KKND. Despite the terrible pre-mission briefings, the missions themselves are more enjoyable. They are better designed and have a greater degree of variation, especially when you take into account that you've got 3 factions to play instead of just the 2. The gameplay itself is miles above KKND. It looks better, feels better, and control feels natural and rewarding instead of claustrophobic and frustrating. There's also plenty of supporting additions, better multiplayer and skirmish support, unit stat tweaks, and a map editor. No, I don't think it's fair to describe it as a clone of a clone or just write it off as more of the same thing. It was a very worthy sequel, and one that not only fixes many of the problems with the original, but also introduces a brand new faction and some original mechanics too. Giving it such a low score feels like something of an injustice, and I think it speaks more about the state of the genre at the time than the actual game itself. This is one of the reasons we always have to be a little careful about reviews. Just like our own experiences of games, they are subjective. In my retrospective of KKND, I stated that the reason an average game did pretty well was the release date. It arrived in a lull between games, and as such there was no competition for the spotlight. Krossfire did not have that luxury. The August 98 release meant that it wasn't going to be compared to 96's Red Alert, but instead to Total Annihilation, Age of Empires 2 and StarCraft. In North America it was even worse, as the October release put it just a month after June 2000. To quote from that same PC Zone review I mentioned earlier, "To impress anyone these days, a game has to either be original or almost perfect. KKND2, although pretty solid and a vast improvement over its predecessor, is neither of those things. It was a pretty good game for 1998 and it certainly wasn't a clone, but it did have problems, and enough of them that it looked a little lackluster when stacked up against some of its contemporaries." Now, I'm really glad that I took a look back at KKND2, because it answered a question that's been sitting at the back of my mind ever since I fired up the original for the first time in 25 years. I had some fond memories, and I couldn't figure out why the game in front of me just wasn't stacking up to the one in my head. I'm fully aware that I view games differently today than I did when I was in my teens, but I'm no stranger to this feeling, and I'm normally pretty capable when it comes to separating now from then. But after playing Krossfire for a week, it's now all very clear to me. When I thought back to KKND, I wasn't thinking of the original game or the sequel, but rather an amalgamation of the two. What came to mind wasn't two separate games, but instead a single title with the thematic originality and FMV of the first game, combined with the graphics, mechanics and mission design of the second. I suspect I might not be alone in this confusion. It's perfectly understandable, as both games were released within a year of each other, featured an almost identical setting and shared many of the same units. It does make me wonder what would have happened if Melbourne House had gone a slightly different way with KKND2. The engine itself is pretty solid. It's certainly of a very high standard for a game from 1998, and I think if they had developed the theme a bit further than same again but now with robots, and put more effort into the briefings and spent a little more time polishing up the rough edges, then they might have created a product that really made its mark, even in a market that was saturated with excellent releases. But unfortunately that's not how it turned out. Instead we got Krossfire, a game that critics described as somehow better and worse at the same time. Hi there, thanks for listening to me talk Krossfire. If you enjoyed this video then click the like button, and if your own memories are clouded by both games then let me know in a comment. And as usual, if you want more of this sort of thing, then subscribe to my channel and I hope to see you back soon.